Okay, this is one of those decisions that I feel is like I was initially hesitant to discuss because I was unsure what the full ramifications of this decision were. And a lot of the time I try to focus on like, trans issues. I know a lot about those and other related types of politics like the social politics. But chat has requested and I've started to read about this, and the more I read about it, the more horrified I am. So we're going to talk about the Supreme Court and the judgments that they just recently issued, and in particular, the Chevron decision. There was a previous ruling in 1984, hilarious, which was called Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, and that gave rise to the Chevron Doctrine. And under that particular doctrine, it stated that if Congress has not directly addressed the question at the center of a dispute, a court was required to uphold the agency's interpretation of the statute as long as that was a reasonable interpretation. So basically, we've got all these government agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, the EPA, which helps us determine and like they create regulations with regards to pollution and, let's make sure we have clean water and clean air. That is considered to be, they're considered the experts. They have actual experts who work there and who they consult with when they're making these decisions. And so basically for a long time, if there is any particular dispute, it's been the case that we just defer to the experts at that agency. And this recent case, what is it called? I guess it was two recent cases, basically. Relentless versus Department of Commerce and Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. They have basically completely struck down this 1984 decision. Back then, the decision was not considered a particularly consequential one, but in the years since then, it became one of the most important rulings on federal administrative law, cited by federal courts more than 18,000 times. Oh no. So the Chevron decision back in the day, it upheld the Reagan-era EPA's interpretation of the Clean Air Act that eased regulation of emissions. And back in then, it was popular amongst conservatives. But now, that ruling has become a target for those seeking to curtail the administrative state, which argues that the courts, rather than federal agencies, should say what the law means. There's a challenge to a rule issued by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Like, I think that the people are really freaked out about this because it could be far-reaching. We have people who are expressing concern about, the Department of Transportation. If the Department of Transportation says that certain things about cars are safe or unsafe, and they're making that opinion as experts in what safety is and how cars work, then this change now opens up any dispute over those decisions. And that could mean, somebody who's making a car that's notoriously unsafe, like Tesla vehicles are notoriously unsafe, then if, somebody who works for Tesla is mad at the Department of Transportation making these rules, okay, well then that means that this has to go to court. Like a judge who does not know about like how cars work, or, who might be friendly with the people who work at that company, like there is a chance that a bunch of non-experts are going to overrule what the individual experts at these agencies are saying. Yeah, people are concerned about it affecting the health department. Regarding the recent mifepristone case, which is like the access to abortion, whatever, like abortion pills, the judge who tried to limit access to mifepristone under this new guidance could just say the FDA's approval of the drug is wrong and doesn't stand. Like the FDA does not get final say anymore. Hi, I'm Alexander and this is Mitternacht. You should hit the like button and subscribe and check out the Patreon. And ooh, look at this hoodie I'm wearing. It's merch. Check it out. Links in the description. Thank you. So like this, it just, there, like how many different government agencies are there? Like list of government agencies. How many different potential like judges could overrule the Department of Homeland Security? Judges could overrule the Department of Commerce. Judges could overrule the Department of Health and Human Services. Yeah, as someone in chat said earlier, what if they just declare in the courts that hormone replacement therapy for trans people is poison, and then the, FDA and the Department of Human Services have no say in it? Yeah, like we have the FDA, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, NASA, the Federal Trade Commission. There are so many different agencies, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And like in particular for me, one of the scariest things about this is, among the many different things that are scary about it, is that this, like, the impact that this can have on the climate going forward. If we have climate experts saying we need to limit emissions dramatically, and then some company disputes these new limitations, like the administration puts through limitations that don't necessarily come through legislatively, they can come through the agency. So let's say the EPA says, no, you can't continue pumping out this certain type of toxin or this certain level of emissions. Then of course those private companies are going to dispute those decisions. And now, instead of deferring to the agency and presuming that the agency has expertise on the matter, some judge is going to have that final say. And in particular, this thing that really tipped it over and made it so I was like, I do have to talk about this on the show, is Roberts, who gave the majority opinion on this ruling, says Congress expects courts to handle technical statutory questions. Like, okay, so Roberts rejected any suggestion that the agencies rather than the courts are better suited to determine what ambiguities in federal law might mean, even when those ambiguities involve technical or scientific questions that fall within an agency's area of expertise. Roberts emphasized, quote, Congress expects courts to handle technical statutory questions, and that courts also have the benefit of briefing from the parties involved and, quote, friends of the court. Like, that's the part that tipped it over the edge for me, is that, we'll listen to certain friends of the court. So, okay, you're just opening this up to a bunch of extremely biased, moneyed interests putting their hand on the button, like putting their hand on the scale, weighing things in favor of effectively deconstructing all forms of regulation, basically. Looking at this, and this is not normally the kind of case that I cover, it's the thing about this is that there's a presumption of good faith a lot of the time. Like, there's a presumption that, the courts are gonna try their best to listen to the experts on this. But the experts work at the goddamn agencies, and there's this assumption that judges are non-biased and everything. But we have seen repeatedly that judges tend to vote along the same party lines as whoever they were appointed by. So if we have a bunch of Republican appointed judges everywhere, and we know that money and favors do impact court decisions, like, this is what we're heading toward. We are, like, this is just basically saying, yeah, anytime there's a dispute over something that the EPA or the FDA or the Department of Health and Human Services, like any of these agencies, which at the present have, like, they're associated with the administration, so they're associated with the executive branch. The judicial branch can now just override anything that the executive branch says through these agencies. And we talk about Project 2025 and all this on the channel on a regular basis because it seems as though one of the big things is getting rid of some aspects of the administrative state. We needed term limits on the Supreme Court like 50 years ago. No kidding. Yeah, they can ignore doctors and experts and have anti-trans judges override our right to health care. They can declare that Plan B is unsafe and that the FDA doesn't get final say in what happens. They can basically nullify any and all environmental protection regulations. Yeah, if the FDA says that something is poisonous and the courts declare that it isn't, then okay, you can just keep pumping that into the environment. You can just keep putting that into the food. What's to stop them? This is basically like, some political analysts are saying that this is one of the most significant power grabs by the judicial branch in living memory, basically. I'm going to read a little bit more here, see if there's anything else from this blog post. This is from SCOTUS blog. Rich. So Gorsuch filed a 33-page concurring opinion where he emphasized, today, the court places a tombstone on Chevron no one can miss. In doing so, the court returns judges to interpretive rules that have guided federal courts since the nation's founding. He sought to downplay the impact of the ruling, contending that, quote, all today's decision means is that going forward, federal courts will do exactly as this court has done since 2016, exactly as it did before the mid-1980s, and exactly as it has done since the founding, which is resolve cases and controversies without any systemic bias in the government's favor. Yeah, it's not systemic bias in the government's favor. It's systemic bias in the favor of the private sector, these corporations that are like, they don't like regulation. Justice Kagan, who read a summary of her dissent from the bench, was sharply critical of the decision to overrule the Chevron Doctrine. Congress often enacts regulatory laws that contain ambiguities and gaps, she observed, which the agencies must then interpret. The question, as she framed it, is, who decides which of the possible readings of those laws should prevail? For 40 years, she stressed, the answer to that question has generally been the agencies, with good reason. Agencies are more likely to have the technical and scientific expertise to make such decisions. She emphasized the deep roots that Chevron has had in the U.S. legal system for decades, saying, quote, it has been applied in thousands of judicial decisions. It has become a part of the warp and weft of modern government, supporting regulatory efforts of all kinds. To name a few, keeping the air and water clean, food and drugs safe, and financial markets honest. By overruling the Chevron Doctrine, Kagan has concluded that the court has created a jolt to the legal system. She pushed back against the majority's suggestion that overruling Chevron would introduce clarity into judicial review of agency interpretations, noting that the majority's assurances that agency interpretations may be entitled to, quote, respect going forward. She observed, quote, if the majority thinks that the same judges who argue today about where ambiguity resides are not going to argue tomorrow about what respect requires, I fear it will be gravely disappointed. She questioned the majority's assertion that Friday's decision would not call into question decisions that rely on the Chevron Doctrine to uphold agency action, saying, quote, courts motivated to overrule an old Chevron-based decision can always come up with something to label a, quote, special justification. Because, yeah, they were saying, the majority opinion was trying to say, oh, well, whatever, 18,000 cases rely on the Chevron judgment, like the Chevron Doctrine, and oh, whatever, we won't. That doesn't mean that all of those previous rulings based on the Chevron Doctrine are invalid now. There has to be some special justification to call those judgments into question. But yeah, this could retroactively mess up every other situation where the Chevron Doctrine has deferred to agency expertise on any particular issue. I feel like this means that judges are going to be expected to be experts on basically everything. Everything that any administrative agency covers. They have to be experts on everything, except that they can't possibly be experts on everything. So they're going to listen with a bias to biased individuals and friends of the court. Money speaks. And I think that this is one of the biggest blows to like checks and balances in this country, like one of the biggest blows to keeping moneyed interests out of governance, like keeping corporations out of governance. We have increasingly seen that corporations are influencing legislation. They have influenced Supreme Court justices because it's totally legal to bribe Supreme Court justices. There's a whole episode of Last Week Tonight about it. And yeah, like this is just creating more situations where any private corporation can challenge any administrative regulation or guidance. And then some probably Republican appointed judge is going to probably rule in favor of those private corporations. Friends of the Court is just an amicus brief and anyone can submit one. Yeah, but who is going to be motivated to do that? The kind of people who are going to be motivated to submit amicus briefs are going like, okay, who's going to submit more amicus briefs, do you think? The corporation with a ton of money to spare who can hire a bunch of quote unquote experts to file amicus briefs, or the government agency, which is running on an increasingly limited budget. Like, who is going to be incentivized to submit amicus briefs? Yeah, the FTC won't necessarily have any power to break up monopolies. Just the far-reaching nature of this decision, I think, is the thing that makes it so incredible and like so difficult to talk about as well. Is like, you sound like a crazy person when you assert that this could basically dismantle all regulation, but that's what it has opened the door to. Remember the name Judge Kaczmarek? He's the preferred person for judge shoppers. We're going to be seeing a lot of deranged fascist rulings from him. I picked up the pronunciation of amicus brief from a lawyer. Yeah, so anyway, I don't know that I have much else to add to this because, yeah, the political, like the far-reaching political implications of this are like so broad that it would be hard to go into each individual situation. But my greatest concern is to do with the FDA and the EPA. Like, my greatest concerns are that we are going to have poison in our food and in our drinking water and in the ground, and that basically any and all regulation of things that could slow climate change, you know, basically like one of the things that people say, oh, it's good that we have Biden instead of a Republican because Biden is actually trying to slow climate change, trying to reduce emissions. Like, well, they're not passing legislation to do that. That's administrative direction of the administrative agencies. And so, yeah, I think my greatest concern is that this is going to open the door to a rapid deterioration of any stopgaps, any attempt to try to slow the change, like slowing emissions, slowing climate change, because things are already going rapidly downhill on that. Yeah, groundwater pollution by county, having lead and everything, gonna prevent any any regulation around microplastics and forever chemicals from going into effect. So, hey, follow my other channel if you want to see like survival content, like hunting, fishing, foraging, and gardening in an attempt to shore up our individual and community collective ability to survive the upcoming food shortages on account of like massive emissions and temperature changes and drought. Currently, lots of the country is seeing drought. So, yeah. It's called @OneOasisLeft. There's a link in the description. Free me from having to talk about the politics all the time. Goodness. Okay, I'm done. I'm done talking about this now. Oh my god, that's insane. Last month was Pride. Now it's time for Wrath. Thank you so much to my patrons, including Tiago Nascimento, Mersh Rolvog, Jack, Amanda B., Michelle Winter, Wellington Marcus, Danielle McDonald, DZXN, Spooky Heather Sylvia, Pasnell Infinity, Suzanne Maynard, Sojo, Jamie Jam, Dizzy Quiche, Jericho, Kevin Young, Liam Hodgson, Athiet, Elavie Nobody, Mr. Atheist, Elizabeth Bartell, Celeste, Nova, and Michelle Frattaroli.